Good evening, everyone. I'm Terry Coney, President of the Lakeland branch, NAACP. Will you please bow your heads for a short prayer?
Most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for all things. We thank you for being God all by yourself. We thank you for the opportunity to come together in peace and to discuss issues that reflect and have to do with your people, your children, your students, this community. We pray that everything be done tonight decently and in order. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I would like to welcome everybody to our forum tonight on critical race theory, what it is, what it isn't, and what's all the fuss about. So why are we here? We're actually here, first of all, to introduce our new president of Polk County Public Schools, Mr. Frederick Hyde. Secondly, we're here to educate and inform on what critical race theory is. But we're not here to promote critical race theory. We're here to educate and give everyone the opportunity to learn on facts and truth and not misinformation. And finally, through this forum, we hope that we can eliminate some of the divisiveness going around on this subject. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Mr. Keith Ward.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us by rainbowbox.com. My name is Keith Ward. I am a member of the NAACP here in Lakeland, the Lakeland branch. I've been so since 2013, and now I'm here working still with Mr. Coney. Thank you all for coming. Thank those of you in our audience. And we're going to go right into it. We have an esteemed panel with us this morning, or this afternoon. From left to right, they're Dr. Vanzel Agosto, Dr. Dana Dorsey Thompson Dorsey, I'll get it right. And lastly, not the president, but the superintendent of Polk County Schools, Mr. Frederick Hyde. Ladies and gentlemen, these are your panels for tonight. We're going to dive right into the question that Mr. Coney asked. Critical race theory, what it is, what it isn't, trying to debunk those things, and then lastly, what all the fuss about. And we talk about fuss. Mr. Hyde, we'll let you go first. Please introduce yourself. Please introduce yourself, and welcome to the panel, and welcome to Polk County.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Fred Hyde, incoming or newly appointed superintendent for Polk County Public Schools. I'm a 20-year veteran in education, in public education. 13 of those years previously were here in the state of Florida. Began my education, I was born and raised in Miami-Dade. I am Hispanic American. I am Colombiano. My mom is from Bogota, Colombia, and very proud of my heritage there and what that means to me and my family. But in addition to which, I moved to Sarasota County, became an educator, spent 4 years there, and was Sarasota County's Teacher of the Year. At that time, I had the opportunities to move to Orange County Public Schools, Orlando, and you'll find that I kind of zigzagged through the state, left, and now I'm back. So I went to Orange County Public Schools, where I was an assistant principal, and helped with successful turnaround of several low-performing schools between being my assistant principal role, and then I moved into 2 successful principalships. Very proud of that work, and then subsequently was recruited to go to the Florida Department of Education, where I was the Bureau Chief for School Improvement. And I led differentiated accountability, assisting for almost 3 years with low-performing schools across the state. And I led that initiative and did so very proudly to ensure that all of our students had equitable access and opportunities. And then from there, I went to Duval County Public Schools as Chief Academic Officer and was fortunate enough to end up as a superintendent, and I chose to go to Illinois for the past 7 years, and now I'm, again, very grateful to be back here in Polk County Public Schools as your new superintendent. So from the school district's perspective, I've been asked quite frequently, and more importantly, why does the district have a role in this evening? And it, you know, the public perception at first, and very much so, was that in some way this was a way for Polk County Public Schools, or me as an incoming superintendent, to begin to encroach and bring critical race theory into our school system. If anyone has been paying attention to our local media, we've been very adamant that, as you know, critical race theory is not something we teach in our schools. It is not part of the state's mandated curriculum. And as you know, back in June 10th, the State Board of Education and the governor made it very clear that critical race theory had no place in our educational system, and subsequently modified some of our curriculum expectations. But I felt it was important to be here tonight to provide, as we talked about as we opened, with a high level of transparency. Because let's be honest, when critical race theory, if the district says that we don't support or we're not instructing critical race theory, a very legitimate question that arises from our community is, what then does Polk County Public Schools do to help support a very diverse student demographic and population and community? Over 50% of our students are minorities. And so we are a majority minority population in our schools, and so we have to be representative and supportive of their needs. And quite honestly, many of the mandates and curriculum mandates from the state of Florida help support that. And so I'm very proud of the fact that as a school district, we have adopted a number of courses, and we've been working to integrate seamlessly cultural awareness into our school system. Again, cultural awareness means when we reflect on our curriculum, do our resources, do our courses reflect all of those cultures? And are they seamlessly embedded and integrated throughout each course, rather than being relegated to 1 month out of the school year? And that's an important distinction. Our board policy actually supports this. Board policy is an extension or is derived directly from statutory authority or statutory mandates from the Florida Department of Education and the legislature. And so our board policies ensure that we focus on several key areas. These areas include ensuring that we have equitable access for our parents and our students. Equity in that regard, just to give you a few examples, would be specific to, as we embrace the fact that we have over 107 languages spoken here in Polk County Public Schools, and many of those are variations of dialects of languages, and students represent, families representing over 55 countries in our Polk County Public School system. It is important for us to be aware of the fact that many of those families need to have an equitable opportunity to engage in the public school system. So again, as an example, do we translate materials for our families so that they can be well informed and we can operate transparently and help them feel truly inclusive in our school settings? Do they have access to resources so that they know how to best advocate for their children and ensure that they get access to those courses? I mentioned before, is our curriculum reflective of both the statutory requirements of our board policy and, more importantly, of the fact that we have a very diverse population of students? It does not delve into one being better than another. It's simply that our students need to see themselves and their cultures reflected in our curriculum, and that is important for them, and that's important to us. We also want to make sure that when we talk about equity of access, that all children truly have an opportunity to participate in extracurricular and advanced coursework in some of the more challenging academies that we've developed. I'll give you a classic example of one area, for example, financial equity. For students who cannot afford to participate in certain activities, like band, the expense for renting a piece of musical equipment or purchasing a music item, for example, an oboe, a clarinet, a French horn, is quite high. And so as a school district, how do we ensure that that financial barrier is eliminated so all students have the opportunity to participate in those things? So that's where the school system operates from. Our central opportunity and our central focus in this regard, again, is to ensure that we're eliminating barriers so that we are truly an inclusive environment for all of our students and families. And that's where we live. Again, that is supported by both board policy and by the state statutory language. So I think that's as good of an introduction as I can do. I was told I had 10 minutes, so there you go, sir.
I think you still had a couple more minutes. But if you're ready to give it up, we'll let it go.
No, sir. I mean, we can touch on a couple other things here. For example, I mentioned a couple of examples of how we actually implement some of these things. We also spend time on cultural awareness. I touched on that.
So I try to be responsive. You take my mic, since I don't have much to say.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So I talked about cultural awareness, and again, we use some of these phrases, but we have to make sure that we have inter-rater reliability, that when we use those phrases and we use terminology, that we all have the same operational definition and the same understanding of what that term actually means. For us as a school district, to help define that, what we mean by cultural awareness is, when I shared before that we have students coming from over 55 different countries, from all over the world, we have to understand that there are cultural norms within those areas and within those families that we need to be considerate of, that we need to be understanding of. For example, in some cultures, children are taught at a very young age, you do not make eye contact with an adult when they're speaking to you because it's deemed disrespectful. Yet in other cultures, if a student isn't looking at an adult when they're talking to them, it's deemed disrespectful as well. In many countries, hand gestures that we commonly use here in the United States are interpreted as an insult. There's also attire There's also interactions and appropriateness amongst genders and those types of things. So when we talk about cultural awareness, it's not about modifying, it's not about bias, it's about an understanding that there are other individuals who we're working with that we need to be considerate of. And it's quite interesting that cultural awareness is a 21st century skill that's highlighted across the nation as something our students need to be able to do. Can they collaborate? Can they interact with others in a very competitive global marketplace? Thank you.
Mr. Hyde, a question just came in. Do you feel that the failure to incorporate CRT into Florida curriculum is really because it's not a standard, or is it due to the unwillingness of some individuals to learn something new or think critically about social, racial, and legal issues, and that there might be some people that just might be upset?
Well, it's very apparent that the topic alone upsets people. And so let's own the fact that right now in our country, this is a political hot button item, as are others. And we are a country that's very divided in our ideologies, our beliefs, our religions, and we need to work more aggressively to unify. But the actual limitation for us, for critical race theory, I'm going to be honest with you, is we look at the standards, and that's what our public school system is about. And we embrace those, and we educate our students on those, and we ensure that our staff are well versed in those so that they too can educate our children accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Hyde. And again, welcome to Polk County Schools.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn to our two professors, both from the University of South Florida. One of them is actually from my hometown. Go Chicago. Yeah, so my mic is starting to fade out like Mr. Hyde's mic. But we'll let you two ladies, I understand that you two professors, please introduce yourselves. Dr. Augusta, you go first. And then after that, Dr. Dana Thompson Dorsey. If you'll please introduce yourself and then go back and forth as you see fit for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, and I'm glad to be here at the NAACP Lakeland branch. My name is Vanzel Agosto, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies, and my emphasis is curriculum studies, and I work alongside Dr. Dana Thompson Dorsey.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, NAACP Lakeland branch. Really appreciate it. I'm Dana Thompson Dorsey, and I have been here in Florida now for about 2 years and at USF for 6 months, maybe 7 months now. I'm an associate professor of educational leadership and policy. I'm also the endowed chair in education innovation and the director of the David C. Anshin Center for the Advancement of Teaching.
Now, as you go into your presentation, ladies, if you would please speak firmly and authoritatively into your microphones so that all of our listeners can hear you, because my battery low on this left side right here. So please help us out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to give an introduction about critical race theory, what it is, and we're going to start with some of the backgrounds, some of the historical roots. So I think it's important to understand that there is a long history of fights for racial equity, racial justice in the United States. And CRT is one way of participating in that. So if we look at some of the background that we have here, we see that there are other proponents of racial justice that this CRT evolves from. And so you might recognize names like Frederick Douglass, or W.E.B. Du Bois, Cesar Chavez, and others. There was the Combahee River Collective, a group of women activists, feminists, who paid attention to things like race, class, gender, sexual orientation, fighting for rights for people who identified in those multiple ways. And so when we talk about some of the themes of CRT, they're not necessarily new. They're drawing on other traditions, other movements. So some of the basic premises we'll talk about, and some of the tenets or some of the principles that guide people when they're using it in research. So one of the things that it focuses on, of course, is race, central in the title. Also critical. The critical comes social theory. So there was a Frankfurt School in social theory about the 1920s, and most of them were of Jewish descent. And when the Holocaust came and they closed their institute, they came to Columbia to start it there. And at that time, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, it branched out. And so we now have various forms, different approaches that use critical in the title. Critical race theory is one, which comes out of critical legal studies. Another, there's also critical pedagogy, and those things will come up later in our presentation as well. So it's the last part of critical race theory. The theory suggests that this is something that you do to explain and understand phenomenon. So you have to analyze situations from a critical perspective, and here critical also deals with power. It is not simply critique. Anyone can give a critique, but it's a critique where you're using power to try to understand the phenomenon. So critical race theory.
So, as Dr. Augusto mentioned, it has a lot of historical roots, and it has been a movement. But it does address ongoing oppression of racial and ethnic minorities, Black, African American, Latino, Latina, and multiple ethnic groups, including Native Americans, and so on and so forth. It stems from this basic idea that race and racism is deeply ingrained in our social structures, political, legal structures and institutions, including education. And it is used in research as an analytical tool. So it has never been taught in K-12 schools. It is rarely even taught in graduate schools and law schools. It's not a common course where you can just go to any university and say, you know, I'm in law school, I should be able to take critical race theory, or I'm in sociology, I can take critical race theory, or in education, I can take critical race theory. It still is not that prevalent as people seem to think. But it is present in many of our graduate programs because it is a way of analyzing society, particularly as it comes to issues of racial oppression. And in terms of critical race theory praxis, which is sort of that combination or intersection of theory and practice, it's an opportunity to reflect on changes that need to occur in society. It's a way to expose and eradicate issues of white racial dominance and ideologies of white supremacy that are so deeply embedded in institutions and structures. But we need to also be clear that when we talk about institutions and structures, as I gave examples of schools or universities or our banking system, legal system, these are systems that have been long created. These are not based on individual actions per se, or particular prejudices or biases that people may have. These are deeply embedded structures that have been around for hundreds of years.
So some of the key tenets or principles in critical race theory we have here on the slide for you. And the first one, racism is ordinary, is the idea that it's a part of society. It's not an aberration, something you hardly ever find, something that's strange or unusual. It's a part of the society. And it is so because racism has been constructed over time. And so another idea is interest convergence. Interest convergence is another way to look at how allies come together around some interests, and then to the extent when they no longer share that interest, they will leave and no longer support whatever it was they were first in solidarity over. And so when one of the founders in legal studies, UCRT, he talked about, his name is Derek Bell, he talked about the idea that it was typically white progressives, white liberals, who would work on like with civil rights movement, for example, would show up until their interests no longer had confluence with whatever the fight was to begin with, and then they might even work against those aims that united them previously.
Another good example I'd like to give for interest convergence as well is something that we're all familiar with, Brown v. Board of Education, correct? And that was probably one of the prime examples that Derek Bell used as an interest convergent example. Brown v. Board of Education 1 was decided on May 17th, 1954, but there were several oral arguments before the Supreme Court before that decision was actually made. So this had gone before the Supreme Court probably late 40s into 1950, early 50s, but this was right after World War II. And this was also a time period when we were entering the Cold War, which became a battle between Russia and the United States of who was going to be the greater or greatest superpower. So at the time, there was a battle going on between Russia and the United States to become the greatest superpower. But part of the way they had to do that was to get some of these third and fourth world countries that were primarily black and brown people to side with democracy if you're the United States, or communism if you were Russia. But the United States realized they could not afford to continue having videos that were shown all across the country of black people being beaten and hanged and chased by dogs and police and beaten with batons. And it was bad. There's no way you can say we're a country that believes in principles of equality and justice when this is happening to their own citizens. So it became a political move, not just one of the Supreme Court, but one in which you had the legislative branch and the executive branch that believed that we needed to show that the United States was truly about equality and democracy. And what better way to do that than with young children? So it became clear, as Justice Warren, who was the High Justice at that time in the Supreme Court, that Brown v. Board of Education was the perfect case to show that we believe United States in equality. So when it went to the Supreme Court, it needed to be a unanimous decision, and it needed to be written in a way that it was short enough to be printed in newspapers across the world. That was an opportunity of interest convergence, a time when those who were deemed the white elite are policymakers, and those who wanted change, black and brown people who wanted to be able to attend any school they wanted and not be segregated by race, and to have the same resources in schools. So that was a perfect opportunity. So the Brown v. Board of Education case was an example that Derek Bell gave of interest convergence. And although we wanted to think that's a theory, it has later been proven in legal documents, in legislative discussions that are recorded, as well as Supreme Court oral arguments and discussions and law clerk notes that were also recorded, that was actually the discussion. This was the case to help the United States become a superpower by attracting more black and brown people in third and fourth world countries.
So in fighting things like racism, and I'll name this white supremacy. So let me say a little bit about that, because I've seen on TV a few parents bring that up, and I want to be clearer about how white supremacy is discussed, not just in CRT, but through organizations like the Anti-Defamation League. So the way I've heard it talked about in some other circles outside of academia is the sense that when white supremacy is targeted, it's as if people are saying that CRT advances the idea that white people are supreme. And that is not what we would want people to think. That's not what we would want students to learn. It is not the idea that white people are supreme by some essentialism or some natural way of being. The idea is that whiteness as a category, as a racial category, has been constructed. How we think about race, how we've learned to think about race, has been constructed over time. So now that we have categories, and schools recognize these categories because of our policies, like No Child Left Behind, they ask us now to desegregate our data according to subgroups, by race, by ethnicity, by disability. And so by federal law, we are supposed to do that as just districts. So the idea of white supremacy is something that gets tackled. It gets exposed through CRT. So there are groups out there who have this ideology of white supremacy that think and promote the idea that certain people who are white, not all white people, have this supreme state of being and should be the chosen people, and all of our structures should work to support them so that they are flourishing, thriving, etc. And so with that exposing and tackling white supremacy, there's also a social justice orientation. So the idea is that there are different types of justices and injustices. So when we think about racial injustice as the center of CRT, there's also a principle called intersectionality that says it's not just race that we should be paying attention to, but it's the intersection of these other categories of identity and categories of oppression. So if I walk into a room, I'm a race person, I'm also a gendered person. I'm also a person with a sexual orientation. And so when we're trying to understand why certain people are experiencing job loss, for instance, why some students are not being accepted or promoted into advanced level courses, we might want to look at race and gender. So intersectionality is another one, social justice. And if those themes, those are themes that you don't appreciate or don't value, I can see why you would not want CRT or any other approach, because there are many other approaches out there that help to tackle things like sexism, racism, patriarchy, homophobia, etc. So if social justice in any of those areas is something that you would advance, I could see not wanting CRT.
Can you go to the slide with the themes? Yes. I don't know if we've mentioned that critical race theory started in this late 70s, early 80s, by a lot of writings by legal scholars, has proliferated into other disciplines, as well as branched off or splintered into other issues to address in addition to oftentimes race. So, for example, for Black and Latinx folks, there's also Latcrit, which addresses a lot of issues around language and immigration. There's Tribal Crit, with Native Americans oftentimes may use Tribal Crit, and while there's still issues of race and ethnicity that may be mixed in there, there's also issues of sovereignty rights. There is Discrit for those who are disabled, who may follow ideas or argue ideas of why people who are disabled should not be treated differently as if something's wrong with them, but have other abilities that should be seen as an asset and should be seen as positive. But these, regardless of the different disciplines, whether you're talking about education or law or different ethnic studies, sociology or psychology, or some of these splinterings into these other areas that I've named, there are these unifying themes. And as Dr. Augusto mentioned, we don't believe in essentializing. This idea of intersectionality, that we are made of multiple identities, we can't assume that because someone is white, that they're racist. That's essentializing. Or if they're a white male, they're a racist, patriarchal person. That's essentializing. That's the complete opposite of what critical race theory argues and stands for. So we recognize that people have their own experiences, their own voices, their own backgrounds, and just because I'm a Black woman, Christian, heterosexual mother of 2 children does not mean that someone else who shares similar identities has the exact same beliefs as I do. So please do not essentialize me and treat me or assume that I have certain beliefs that I may not have. So this idea, as Dr. Augusta said, that CRT is anti-white or argues that there's white supremacy in this world, and we're not arguing that as critical race theorists. We're not saying that critical race theory stands for that. We talk about the history, which is very important too as a theme, because oftentimes we live in a society that just wants to focus on the present and is ahistorical, but we, as critical race theorists, believe in history, understanding history and context. And there's no way we can understand certain things that are happening in this country if we don't understand history, including the foundation of which this country was built. It wasn't built all in love. It wasn't Christopher Columbus who came to America and just found it there and said, this is land we shall build. There were indigenous, natives, Americans here who were killed, who were raped, who were enslaved, who lost the land. They were the original people here. And we can't act like that did not happen. But there were certain structures that were put in place to build the economy of this country, to build the land as it is. And there were people who were enslaved, who lost their lives, their families, their language, their culture, and forced to build an economy, who were forced to become involuntary immigrants. And that's oftentimes not acknowledged or recognized. But we still see some of that today. Even in our prison systems, for example, we have a 13th Amendment that says you are not forced to serve as a slave or involuntary servitude, except if you're in prison. And our prisons are made of primarily Black and brown people. So they are enslaved, and even many times when they are released from prison, they don't have the opportunity to vote in many states. We went through that argument here, even in Florida. It's still an issue of contention. And there's a lot of rights that they lose as citizens simply by being in prison. And that is its own bondage in itself. But these are long-standing systems, structures that have been in place. And CRT simply acknowledges that.
So as someone who has used CRT, and it's not the only framework I used, it depends on what the problem is that I'm examining. But as someone who has used it, I would say it's difficult to use. It's difficult to engage the principles such as intersectionality. The idea that, for instance, 2 or 3 or 4 aspects of your identity are intersecting around multiple oppressions, to really tease that out, it's difficult to work interdisciplinary so that you're not an expert in education, you're also an expert in other fields, whether that's law or sociology or philosophy, so you're bringing that in as well. So I don't think it's an easy thing to do, and for that reason, I don't see that that's something we would have children learn because they're not developmentally able to do that. They don't have the understanding of multiple disciplines. They're not able to do that type of intellectual rigor and the time it takes to do something like that. So for me, that would make sense why we don't have that and we're not teaching it in schools. Does that mean that people are not using it in schools? No, not necessarily, but the battle that we're seeing in all of the fuss and what's being written into the rules for Florida education is to not teach it in schools. So a lot of districts have come out and said, we're not teaching it. It is not subject matter. It is not in the state statute around what instruction should occur in the schools. It's not in the standards. So there might be teachers who are using it. There might be administrators who are using it or using something like it to answer questions about disproportionality in discipline, about the overrepresentation of black boys in particular in special education, about many of the other issues that you may be aware of already. So what's all the fuss about? Where is this coming from? And so in part, before 2018, you would be hard-pressed to find a news article that had CRT in the title of a major news source. You would be hard-pressed to find it in the title of a major, in a headline that linked it to education in K through 12. In maybe 2018, you will see some of the first headlines when the Southern Baptist Leadership Conference had their annual conference, and they were trying to add something called Resolution 9, where it specifically stated CRT would be something that they would use in helping them to address some of the issues that they were confronting. And so there was a big battle over that. And that was just decided now that that's not a part of it, but it doesn't sway their work around civil rights. Russell Vought, who was working with the Trump administration, I think he was a management office budget, something like that. He since left as the administration ended, and he started a conservative think tank and an activist arm of that think tank. And so he's been very vocal with this think tank and trying to continue the idea of Make America Great and using CRT as this sort of boogeyman as something that we need to rally against. And if you look at his website, which I don't have here to show you, he also has a list of terms, a long glossary of terms that say that these are some of the buzzwords around CRT. So basically, if you see these words, perhaps CRT is being taught, but people are not using CRT, they may be using other words. And you'll see culturally relevant teaching as one of those words. You'll see abolitionist teaching, and I don't know how long the list is because I didn't finish scrolling. Every time I look at it, it's very long, but you can look at that. Before that, there was someone else who, if you remember when Trump said that there should be no use of CRT in professional or personnel training, not in the military, things like that. The person who he drew that from was another person who worked for conservative think tanks, a conservative magazine, and he said that he had done research and he found evidence that CRT was being used widely in many different places and going under different names. And so after he made that on one of the talk shows, he made his presentation about his findings, then I think it was 2 days later, Trump had that executive order to remove that from all of the training. And so that's when it hit the national headlines. But there's a current fight being pushed forward, and there are manuals now instructing parents how to fight CRT. And it's so for as much as people continue to say we're not teaching this in schools, there still seems to be this rising attack on CRT being taught in schools.
Right. Can you go to the slide that actually, I think it has, how did CRT get promoted in the public stream? And then the slides that follow, because that gives at least some of the websites. Even though we can't open the websites, we can let people see some of the information. It's not coming up? Okay.
Nope.
So, okay, our slides aren't working. So on our slides, we had some links to a couple of videos and direct links for you to be able to check out some of this information on your own. But we're having some technical difficulties and are unable to access our PowerPoint. But I'd like to also mention, Dr. Augusto talked about what's all the fuss about, why now? And there seems to be a clear connection of critical race theory being connected to politics. prior to all of these discussion that we're now seeing happening that has spread because of a lot of politicians who don't seem to understand what critical race theory is, it was brought up in 2012, March of 2012, when Barack Obama was running for re-election. And there were videos circulating of Barack Obama in 1990 when he was the editor-in-chief of Harvard Law Review, first African American to hold that role. And Derek Bell, who was a tenured professor in the law school at that time, was in protest and was threatening to leave, and in fact he did resign from Harvard Law School because Harvard Law School was refusing to tenure professors of color, particularly black professors and women. And there were students that were also in protest. As editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review, Barack Obama invited Derek Bell to talk about what he was protesting and why. And there was all this video circulating that was begun by Breitbart and Fox News, showing this video. And in this video, Barack Obama also hugged Derek Bell. And all the news story was saying that Barack Obama hugged Derek Bell, who's a racist and a critical race theorist. That means Barack Obama is also a racist and a critical race theorist. And this was playing all over the news. You even had, at the time, Benjamin Jealous, I believe, who was the president of the National NAACP, being asked about it. And he said, "This is just ridiculous. I'm not going to even address this." But at the time, Derek Bell had just passed away, maybe a year or two before that. And they were attacking him as one of the founders of critical race theory, but they wanted to connect Barack Obama to him to mess up his opportunities to be reelected. It didn't gain much traction, but that was the last time until last year, and I guess around 2018, but definitely last year, when President Trump said no critical race theory can be used in diversity training, which it wasn't. But every time it seems to come up, there's some kind of political connection to it. It's just now it's become a huge issue, and critical race theory, the term, has become the catch-all for any discussions around race, racism, sexism, patriarchy. It's deemed as being anti-American when it's, once again, the exact opposite. But it seems to be based on a lot of political chatter.
So going back to the idea of critical race theory and Bell and Obama, one of the charges that came out of that sort of political discussion was that Obama was against American exceptionalism. He was against the idea that America is a great place, which is not the way historically American exceptionalism has been described. Exceptional doesn't mean, in this case, a great place. Exceptional has meant unique, and that the way it was founded through colonization makes it unique. It being a newer country makes it unique. In other ways, it's been unique. And so this idea that it's against American exceptionalism, this idea continues on today, especially when you look at what's happening with the restrictions around American history and civics. So we can look at two of the projects that are pertinent to this conversation with schools and with some of the rules that have come down recently for Florida. And so you may have heard of the 1619 project. In 1619 was when a ship came to Virginia with 20 or so slaves from Africa. And in that same year, we had the first, I think it was Congressional Convention, so sort of the start of, the development of this country. And so the 1619 project was an essay in the New York Times that commemorated that 1619 date in those events. And so Nicole Hannah Jones, who's the creator of the 1619 essay, they since, with New York Times, have put together a podcast, and they put together a website that has instructional materials if you're interested in using the 1619 project. Now, recently, one of the rules that came through to supposedly help clarify the statute. So as I said earlier, the statute already tells us things like what we should be teaching in Florida schools. We should be teaching about the history and contributions of African Americans, about Native Americans, about the Holocaust education, etc. So there are many other parts of the statute. So the 1619 project was just recently banned. And so some people say CRT was banned. It's not, CRT wasn't banned. To clarify, it's any theory such as CRT that teaches race as anything other than something that is done by individual people. That's not something that's embedded in the structures of society. And so it doesn't limit it to CRT, it just gives CRT as an example. Any theory that it does not teach racism as an individual thing, that talks about it being structured in society and something that is done to promote white supremacy. You're not supposed to teach racism in that way. It does actually ban, it says that educators may not use the 1619 project as any in their instructional materials. So you're not to use the podcast, you're not to use the essay. So that's clear. So here's one contradiction. So the 1619 project was created by Nicole Hannah Jones, who is, we may say, African American. She has a mother who was white, English and Welsh, and she has a father who is African American. And so like Obama, she may claim, I don't know that she has, she may claim affinity to African Americans. I'm not really sure. But if, because of our history, and there's a one drop rule that if you had any part of you was of African descent, you'd be counted as Black or African American. So if we go with that idea that at least in part she's African American, then if we restrict her materials, we contradict the statute. The statute says we're supposed to be teaching about the contributions, the history and the contributions of African American. She's an African American, at least in part, woman, so we're banning her. And so that's part of it. Also, if you think about the 1619 project, there's also something called the 1776 project. Mm-hmm. And this was created by Trump, and he created a commission around 1776 to increase patriotic education. And so if you understand the way that in America, the educational system, it's governed by the states, not the federal government. And so his project tries to increase this idea of patriotism looks this way. And they created a commission. Now they even have a 1776 PAC that raises money to hire, to elect, identify and elect school board members who would support this project. So again, we see how it is also governed by a conversation pushed forth by politicians, and it's not just CRT.
Right. Yes. So because we don't have access to our slides, I think it's important, as Dr. Augusto was saying, the hoopla in Florida. Well, first, even prior to Florida passing this policy, you already had, now there's 6 states that have created laws that are being said to ban critical race theory. I've read those laws. That's in the states of Texas, Oklahoma, New Hampshire, Iowa, Idaho, and Tennessee. And the language is pretty similar in all of the legislation that has passed, is that teachers do not have to be forced to teach anything where an individual of one race is better than an individual of another race. or an individual of one sex is better than an individual of another sex, or where people, particularly children, are made to feel bad about themselves or feel anguish that because of they're being told that they're racist or sexist. Iowa is specific to diversity training. It's almost the exact same language that was in Donald Trump's executive order that he put in place in September 2020, that has since been overturned by President Biden. But the interesting thing is, it doesn't mention, none of the legislation specifically says critical race theory. However, they think they're using language of critical race theory by referring to an individual. And once again, you didn't hear us talk about critical race theory dealing with individuals. Critical race theory addresses issues of systemic, structural, historical issues that involve racism, that involve sexism or patriarchy. And that is not to say that America, you know, the United States of America is not a good place, a great place. But we know historically, Africans and their descendants were, and Native Americans, deemed as African descendants as property. Native Americans as savages were not included in the Declaration of Independence. They were not considered men, or all men are created equal. And women were not included in that either. Women could not buy property or sign contracts. Women did not get the right, at least white women, did not get the right to vote until 1920. That is true, that is factual. These are written in laws and legal cases, the 3/5 compromise of the Constitution. African and all their descendants, being as though they were chattel and property, could be deemed 3/5 of a person for taxation purposes. That is law, that is factual. It says nothing about individuals. CRT does not talk about individuals being racist or sexist. It talks about structures that are deeply embedded and have been in the United States even before the United States was called the United States, when it was just colonies. And then even after the American Revolution, and you have 1776, those ideas, structures remained in place. And now we see them in different laws and policies in different ways today. Has nothing to do with the individuals. And as for children or anyone feeling bad about themselves or guilty, there is no intention by telling the truth, the facts about American history, is made to make white children or any children feel bad about themselves. If anything, it's to say, this was our history. Unfortunately, we still see some remnants of it in different laws and policies that exist, such as, but you are our future. You will be the one to make the difference, to make the change. We are not, this is nothing about calling you, your parents, your grandparents, or even your grandparents bad people. This is about you learning history so that we do not make the same mistakes and continue to perpetuate oppression based on race, gender identity, or sexual orientation, religion. And you young people will be the one to make that change, because you've learned the facts, you know the truth, and we are counting on you. I think all children would love to hear that said to them.
So 2 other things to be aware of in education. So recently there was a memo that I don't know that a lot of people know about this, that came out of the Florida Board of Education, and instructing districts to not really consider instructional materials in mathematics that included social emotional learning and culturally relevant teaching. And so when we talk about CRT, and we put a lot of focus on CRT, there are other things that are being restricted that we may not know. And whatever the rationale is, I don't have that in front of you but there's a rationale. But that's a memo that's about what cannot, or what textbooks, what other instructional materials can even come up for review in order to be adopted. Another thing is Biden has money that he is using in terms of grants for school districts. That in that background for that grant, it mentioned the 1619 project, and it mentioned work by Ibram Kendi that talks about how to be an anti-racist. So he refers to those different projects, different ideas, as part of the rationale for why we need to have more attention to diversity and cultural competence, things like that, and have funding for that. There were a lot of complaints, a lot of groups got together to petition, to write in, to say they wanted to have 1619 removed and they didn't want CRT to be taught. Not because CRT was mentioned, because they're associating Kendi's work on anti-racism with CRT, which is not CRT. He doesn't use CRT and he doesn't claim that in any way. And the 1619 project is not a CRT-informed project either. So neither one of them are related to CRT, but a lot of the comments that were coming in wanted to restrict CRT. Since then, it's been removed, and that was just a few days ago. So the actual reference to Kendi's work and 1619 is removed, but the substance stays the same. And it's the idea is still that we need to focus on things like systemic marginalization in schools. And it's not the requirement. You don't have to focus that on the grant. That is one idea that will be considered. People will be interested in that when reviewing it, but it is not the only thing that will make you eligible for this grant.
Mr. Ward, you have some questions for us?
Thank you.
I can tell.
It was time to segue.
Yes, I can
to get
tell.
in. So are we getting anything out of this by a round of applause today? We get anything out of this? Thank you so much. So I've gotten several questions in, and as we segue, Dr. Dana Thompson-Dorsey, if you'll make those websites and links available to us, I'm going to talk to the camera. I'm talking to you, Dr. Dorsey, even though I'm not facing you. If you'll make that available to us, we'll put that on our Facebook page and et cetera, so that people can have access to that information that you want to present to us. It was brought to our attention that some of the slide information here live was not being able to be seen, and so hopefully we'll be able to reach out to you also to get those slides. Mr. Hyde, we're going to come back to you. Even as Dr. Agosto and Dr. Thompson-Dorsey were talking, they made comment on how that when we teach things, sometimes we don't get the full effect. So one question came in: are Polk County school students taught the good, the bad of the state's history, such as the U.S. Constitution counting blacks as 3/5 of a person, and required that slaves be returned to slave owners, or that it was illegal to teach slaves to read? Now, after everything that the two doctors have unpacked, how do we address that same thought process with teaching our students? And then I think one of the most important things they talked about was truth. How do we teach the truth and not break the law?
And so the Florida standards do allow us to address those two specific areas. We just can't simply present them in the construct that one is more evil or better than another. But our entire series and course series, I mean, I couldn't speak to the specificity of each individual benchmark, but I do know that those two topics are addressed. And quite frankly, the speakers, the panelists, fellow panelists up here tonight brought up some interesting points from the standpoint of, while we do not teach critical race theory, in our school system, we do work to address the inequities of students and the disproportionality that exists within our school system. And there are disproportionalities. Every year, the Florida Department of Education requires that we submit a report under the Florida Educational Equity Act. And actually, we're going to present on this next Tuesday, on the 27th at our board meeting. We submit this report every year, and it talks about diversity and what are the numbers. And so if I were to tell you that for dual enrollment, that we saw a 10 percentage point improvement in black students from 2016 participating in dual enrollment to 2020, 2021, I think we would be very happy about that.
Excuse me, Mr. Hart, what is dual enrollment?
Dual enrollment is students who are attending high school simultaneously as they're earning college credits. However, that 10%, when you actually drill down, equates to just 292 students. So when we report a percentage, it's a percent of a percent. And so yes, have we seen almost twice as many students participating in dual enrollment who are black? Yes. But as far as the representation of our total enrollment of black students, it is disproportionately low. The same is true for Hispanics, the same is true for English language learners, which brings up another very valid point. If a student moves to this country and is language deficient, do they get access to the same rigorous coursework that he or she may have been participating in their native country? And the reality and the answer simply stated more often than not is no. And so we as a school system have to own the fact, again, regardless of CRT, we have an obligation to address these disparities in our school system, and quite frankly, we cannot be satisfied, we cannot rest until 100% means 100%. That is where we have to live. And we have 21 low-performing schools, turnaround schools, and you look at their enrollment, and disproportionality is absolutely a recurring theme there, but we do have to also add socioeconomic status to this as well.
So what you answered was, yes, we're going to teach about 3/5 a person, and yes, we're going to teach about slaves being returned, but not trying to make one race seem bad per se.
Superior to another.
Superior to another. Okay.
Correct. It's not about, we teach the concepts and the benchmarks explicitly, and it's not about developing a construct, as you pointed out, of blame, of fault. And again, there were revisions within the code, as one of my other panelists pointed out, that explicitly excluded certain aspects within the curriculum. But those, to my recollection, those two are not them.
One last question, Dr. Hyde, I'm going to move on. Can you promise that teachers will not face repercussions for discussion with students that regard race? So little Johnny comes up and actually takes a nose dive because he's actually reading at home and learning something on his own, and he asks a teacher a question that may be relevant to the subject, but you have to peel that onion back a little further. Is that teacher going to be admonished for going into more detail with that particular student in the classroom setting?
In the manner in which you described, the answer would be no. Teachers have an obligation and expectation that they teach in the moment, in real time, as matters present themselves. Again, as you frame that question, that teacher is not delving into the aspects of critical race theory, those areas that have been banned by the state of Florida. So for a teacher to be able to engage in their classroom in a meaningful discussion, if we're talking about slavery, if we're talking about American history, if a topic comes up and a student asks a question, the teacher has the right and the opportunity to address that question. However, they must be cautious not to interject themselves into the narrative. And that's probably the biggest concern that I hear more frequently than not from parents is when we talk about race, when we talk about religion, when we talk about politics, how do we ensure that our teachers remove themselves from that narrative? And that's difficult at times because there are times that you pointed out, a student will ask them, well, what do you think?
Right.
So there's a difference though between sharing what, in generalities, what they may think or coming across as if the teacher is trying to impose their ideology or thought process on students. And that's at times content, it's a fine line we walk sometimes, but teachers have the right to engage students in a meaningful discourse in their classrooms.
It just seems like human nature, and I have a couple of friends that are in the audience now that, is it sometimes hard to displace being a teacher to your own view based on what you're actually discussing? No? Okay. Those two people said no. Okay, great. And it was somewhere in this part of the audience. So you're not seeing who I'm talking to. All right. So back to our two professors. This is something that you guys can delve into. Thank you, Mr. Hyde. And we're coming back to you, so keep drinking water.
Yes, sir.
If I could
Examples of how, and then for those of you who are not as swift as I am, I kept hearing the phrase CRT, 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 and I forgot that we're talking about critical race theory. One of the things that Dr. Thompson Dorsey mentioned is that it has become a catch-all. And I think that's the critical piece critical, no pun intended, that we're missing here, that it's a catch-all. And with that catch-all, it's going to other areas. And then the school board is getting caught up in that fight. Would you agree with that, Dr. Thompson Dorsey? Give an example of how CRT would address the Dred Scott decision in a high civics class. What would you say to that?
So I would agree that, yes, critical race theory has been used as a catch-all for so many other issues. But, okay.
I got that from you.
Okay, so you're asking me about Dred Scott, like how would that be addressed? So as I understand it, as part of the curriculum, I believe as part of U.S. history, students read about the Declaration of Independence, they read Dred Scott, they read, which Dred Scott v. Sanford is a United States Supreme Court case that came out 1859, in which a man, Dred Scott, had moved several times with his slave master beginning from Missouri, a slave state, to Illinois, which was not a slave state, and back to Missouri. The law was written as if you are living in a free state, you're free, and you're always free. So although he moved back to Missouri with his slave owner then dies, he says he's free and he wants to go about his life, but the family refuses to free him. They say he's not free, he's still enslaved. So it makes its way to the Supreme Court, and Justice Taney, who was the Supreme Court justice who wrote the decision, gives these examples. Well, first of all, it says he's not free. It says Africans and all their descendants are slaves and will be slaves their entire lives because they were brought to this country as chattel, as property. They are not human. They are not to be deemed as people or as men, as written in our Declaration of Independence. They are not to be counted in the Bill of Rights or any part of the Constitution because they're property. So only that 3/5 compromise where they can be 3/5 of a person for taxation purposes. They are chattel, they are property. So if students are reading this alongside of a Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and we're talking about teenagers, and I'm sure they will have the question or want to know, this sounds racist. This sounds unfair, unjust. How do we reconcile that, teacher? I can't imagine a teacher who may be afraid to even answer that question, being able to teach. Or if students, even if a teacher refuses to answer or tries to move past it, there'll be some students who want to talk about it. And the policy that now is supposed to interpret the law around instruction says that teachers are to facilitate student discussion. Students have that First Amendment right to be able to lead discussion. And a teacher can't teach. Is that correct, Mr. Hyde? If a student's asking them a direct question and it's written right in front of them, what is a teacher to do?
I'm trying to understand the question. So if a teacher is in the middle of a course and a student has a question related to the course, or a student brings up something?
They're bringing up they're trying to reconcile how we say we're a country that doesn't see color, that doesn't see race, but they're reading the Dred Scott case, and in which a Supreme Court justice specifically says that African and all their descendants are property. They're not to be counted as men in the Declaration of Independence or counted in the Constitution because they are property. And if a student wants to know how is that just, isn't that racist, teacher? Would a teacher say and not violate this policy?
Sure. There are ways for an educator to go about engaging students in student discourse. For example, depending on whether or not, to ensure that it's age and developmentally appropriate, you can create lessons and activities that allow students to engage and take differing opinions and bring them to the forefront and have constructive dialogue and debate within a classroom setting. We do that quite frequently. Again, the goal here is to ensure that the teacher themselves is not interjecting themselves, more importantly, their own opinions into this narrative, because that's where the hazard lies. But supporting a narrative, supporting a discussion is different, but it has to be regulated. It has to be done carefully, quite honestly.
And since part of that policy is to facilitate discussion, a teacher cannot shut down the discussion, because we do have Supreme Court cases, current ones, that actually say students have the right to lead. Anything that is student-led is allowed. And so if students are leading this discussion or having a debate about it, a teacher is to encourage that to happen. they should not give their personal opinion. Well, I think it's racist. Well, I think, this is unjust. But allow the students to be able to unpack that. It would be unfair, I think, to move past that important discussion being had. And if a question then comes, well, this was in the 1800s and then slaves were freed, so this is no longer the truth? This is no longer happens? There's no longer this belief? That's, I think, where it gets a little tricky.
Very much so. And I think teachers have to, like I pointed out before, are walking a very fine line at times because, using the example again that you're sharing here, that teacher also has while students do have that First Amendment right, there are also, as you know, rights and liabilities that we have to ensure that student behavior also doesn't become disruptive to the educational process. And so if that conversation were to go down a path where it becomes combative, argumentative, and it's not able to be controlled, then the teacher absolutely has the obligation to redirect that and cease that immediately. However, again, I think we forget at times too that teachers have multiple tools in their toolbox, and it's not always just open discourse. It's also through written responses, it's also through research papers, it's also through, and again, I'm talking age developmental appropriateness. How do we engage in these meaningful conversations where allowed and to the extent allowed so that we can support our students who want to be more, who are inquiring, right? They're inquiring, how does this apply? And again, we have African American history courses where some of this is actually discussed as well. But I do believe, and our teachers in many instances are walking a very fine line because they have to be very careful.
And if I could add, I don't know how you would teach the civil rights movement without racism being part of that. I don't know. Maybe there are other skilled teachers who teach that who know. I just really don't know. It's an honest question. Sure. You're going to answer? Go ahead.
No, I don't have an answer to that, quite frankly. I mean, because the reality of it is that the way we deliver instruction, I guess I do have an answer, would be the way we deliver instruction is very factual at times, and it's, again, aligned to the benchmarks and standards we're teaching. And so, can you teach civil rights? Can you teach about slavery without fundamentally realigning it back to racism? We have been doing that for a very long time in our instruction. And so right now, as you know, very well know, that that's prohibited right now for us to make that connection. And so we do not.
How do you
Before you guys go-
I don't know how that's possible.
Yeah,
So this is one of the challenges I'm
That
sure
is not
teachers have to
possible.
go with. As I try to jump in between the professors and the superintendent, this is what I feel teachers have to go through, a classroom management. Trying to keep the discussion going, but at the same time, we've got to move forward. You did mention civil rights and racism. Here's a question to the two professors. Does teaching about Jim Crow and civil rights struggle through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and well into the 20th century run afoul of Florida's CRT ban in our schools? I'll say it again. Does teaching about Jim Crow and civil rights struggle through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and well into the 20th century run afoul of Florida's ban in our schools today?
I want to, I think there's some important points to be made that we couldn't show on our PowerPoint, and that is exactly what the policy says, that is contradictory in terms of teaching. So if you're supposed to talk about, as it says, instruction on required topics must be factual and objective, so you're not giving your opinion, but telling the facts and sharing the facts, may not suppress or distort significant historical events such as the Holocaust, slavery, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and the contributions of women, African American, and Hispanic people to our country. They get into talking about critical race theory in this policy that you cannot distort historical events. So you would be distorting historical events if slavery is not taught as anything other than racist. Okay, that's distorting it. That is lying. That is not being factual and objective. You have to be factual and objective. You don't go to another continent, pack people in a ship who don't speak the language, who don't look like you, who prior to the 1600s, we weren't talking about people were black and brown or white. People were types and kind and all of that. But suddenly, when we have several people enslaved in this country from another continent, they're now black, negros, Indians or Los Indios, and that's all of a sudden, as Dr. Augusto mentioned, where race becomes a social construct, a political construct, a legal construct, because we all know we fill out all those papers that always, everything we fill out us our race and ethnicity, everything. So there is no way you can possibly teach the truth, be factual, and not make that connection that those who came from another continent by force, packed in a ship, in the transatlantic slave trade, millions of them dying or jumping off the ship because they'd rather be free in death than come to another country to be forced to be separated from their families, forced in another country, another language, be beaten, to build an economy on, sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, to build an entire country, not get any credit for it, just because.
If I could jump in here, I would say, yes, you can. You can teach all of those things without it amounting or adding up to racism. You could teach everything you just said and never name it as racism, because racism is a construct or a concept. It's something that we use. It's a broad term that packs in a lot of meaning, so we don't have to keep saying A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We can just say racism, like sexism. Many things are constructs because they pack a lot of information, a lot of ideas, and it's shorter just to use that. So one of the issues that I have problems with restricting critical thinking in general and critical thinking related to issues of power is that, well, remember, we're talking about restrictions, rules for public education. We're not talking about private schools. So when the talk comes out that CRT is entering schools, and some of the examples that were given about, for instance, Kendi coming to a school and paying money, it was a private school that did that. It wasn't a public school who could afford to bring him to have that talk. So the private schools are able to use constructs, to use concepts as part of their higher order thinking. So you can avoid constructs such as racism or classism.
But how do you, what happens when the students call it, what happens when they name it that?
Well, then you could say, well, what does that mean? Tell me what it means. Look it up. Does it add up to that? What are some of the other arguments? Let's have some discussion around this.
There's also an important clarification here. It's not that we can't talk about racism. It's that we can't inherently direct and blame it on critical race theory. I mean, that statute goes on to read, as you cited, that the state board approved standards include the denial or minimalization of the Holocaust and the teaching of critical race theory, meaning the theory that racism is not merely a product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. Instruction may not utilize materials from the 1619 Project. It does not completely prohibit or ban the topic or the conversation and the narrative around racism. You know, the question came up about when we talk about slavery and bringing indigenous, other people to our country, which, let's be honest, globally that's happened all around the world.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
But it's happened in our own country. Is it explicitly linked to racism? I don't know that that connection is more often than not made. I think it's more of a construct. Why did we arrive here? And it's more along the economic lines of how our country was being developed. However, we are not explicitly forbidden from talking about racism. We just can't make that connection. And again, issue blame.
You can't, if you read it again, you're not to talk about racism as something that's embedded, structured in society that promotes white supremacy.
Correct.
Which leaves it to the other part that you said, it's sort of based on the individual, right? So if I teach about racism as the individual perpetuating racism, then I'm back to the idea that there are racist people, and I can point them out. You're a racist, you're a racist, you're a racist. And so CRT and other approaches have helped us move beyond that, because that is not necessarily useful, and it gets into the kinds of trouble and kinds of issues where people are pointing fingers and feeling uncomfortable. But CRT helps us look at the structures. So what this rule rejects is not CRT. CRT is an example, but what it rejects is the teaching of racism in a particular way.
Correct.
Right.
So that gets at viewpoint diversity. Are we unable now, we're restricted in how we talk about racism, and it's not like a unique thing that this is just something that people individually understand. Like this understanding of racism is pretty prominent now, that when we're talking about issues in the police force, issues in education, other economic issues, that racism is a part of those systems, and whether or not that person who created a rule is still there, they may be gone, but the rule in effect still leads to the disproportionality. So even if it wasn't intentional, right, there's no need to point a finger at anyone. It's there, and if we look at the outcomes, there are disparities in the outcome, and they keep amounting up to certain groups of people are at the bottom. Certain people are not the top of all of the things that we have as indicators of a great life in this country and many countries.
And I have to disagree respectfully, Mr. Hyde, that we have a ton of legal cases that talk about racism, that talk about white supremacy in its language. The Dred Scott case is one of them. Plessy v. Ferguson is another. The language of being, you can't legislate, this is in Plessy v. Ferguson, you can't legislate people being inferior or better than they are when they are inferior. They're socially inferior, and they should be kept separate. That's when the idea of the one-drop rule really was birthed, because Plessy having 1/8 black blood. Even by his appearance, he looked white, but by that 1/8 black blood made him socially inferior, that he had to be relegated to the black rail car. Okay. So we have in our, and this is why critical race theory is important to understand, it being created or developed as a movement by legal scholars, that it is not simply a theory. Because as lawyers, and I am one of them, I would be crazy to make an argument that is not grounded in documents, in writing. So critical race theory as developed by legal scholars, they didn't make it up. It's in writing. It's in legal cases. It's in legislation. And it's in the documents and
Dana,
conversations that were recorded on paper,
Dana,
that discuss these
it's
issues.
in the Florida state statute for
Yes.
what we should be teaching in schools.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
it's only there in one place you'll find racism, and it's under the section that talks about Holocaust education. So that when you're teaching about Holocaust education, you should be teaching about, or you teach about the Holocaust, you should be teaching about things like anti-Semitism, prejudice, and racism. So it specifically states that.
But where did the Holocaust take place, Dr. Augusto? Was it the great United States of America?
Yeah, so it's okay.
It's okay because it was another country.
There.
It was another country.
Right.
But we essentialize the United States as being so great. So we can't talk about racism here or sexism here, but we can talk about it if we're talking about Europe.
But we can't talk about the continued anti-Semitism, talk about white supremacy, and connect that to the Holocaust today and some of the things that are happening recently. So then we're getting back at, if we're supposed to be teaching about the Holocaust and we're supposed to be teaching about racism related to the Holocaust, can we then go to like the Anti-Defamation League and see the anti-Semitism, the violence that's perpetuated through the ideology of white supremacy? Does it restrict that education as well?
One thing we can talk about here is that I think we had a great discussion tonight. And And I have to apologize to the audience and to our panelists because there is no way that you could possibly capture everything that this subject offered up in an hour and a half. But I think our panelists did an outstanding, exceptional job. So I'd like to thank Superintendent Hyde, Dr. Thompson Dorsey, and Dr. Augusta for coming out and sharing all your knowledge with us. It was tremendous. I was blown away with everything that came out tonight. So I think we got across the point on what critical race theory is. I'm not sure that everybody may understand what it isn't, but I think we all know what's all the fuss about. And that whether you say critical race theory, whether you say CRT, in some circles it is a all-encompassing term. In some circles it is used political, and most circles it's used as the boogeyman. But what we want to use moving forward is stick to the facts, stick to the truth, and even when it comes to our kids, try to minimize the misinformation. Because, you know, as we were closing out the discussion, we got into Europe and that continent and even Asia. But we must remember that compared to those countries, the United States is still in its infancy state. So what we need to teach our kids is that there's good and bad about America, about the United States. But we're still a developing country. So we do need to teach all threads of that good and bad as we move forward, so our kids can take all of that and make this the most perfect nation and let their kids know that it is truly now and we believe that all men and women and all races and ethnicities are created equal and are endowed by certain inalienable rights. And they have those liberties of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We thank you all for coming out tonight. It's been a great educational moment, and unfortunately we just didn't have enough time. And for all those that put in questions and then get their questions answered, maybe we can pass those on to the doctors and the superintendent, and maybe we can get those answered for you. Thanks everybody for coming out.